The screams echoing from the Mallory plantation that October night in 1854 weren't human. They were the hungry squeals of hogs devouring something in their pen. By dawn, only tattered fabric and bone fragments remained scattered in the mud. The master of the house, Edward Mallory, had vanished without a trace. But Hester Caldwell, the woman who prepared his meals and poured his whiskey, knew exactly where he had gone. She had watched those same hogs consume the evidence of her carefully planned revenge, their snouts stained with what the other slaves would whisper about for generations to come. What drove a kitchen slave to such desperate measures, and how did she manage to fool an entire community into believing their most powerful plantation owner had simply ridden away drunk into the night? Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The story of Hester Caldwell begins not with murder, but with a mother's desperate love and the crushing weight of bondage that shaped every moment of her existence. Born into slavery on a smaller farm outside Natchez in 1828, Hester had been sold to the Mallory plantation when she was barely 16, torn from her own mother's arms and transported to Vicksburg in chains alongside 12 other enslaved people Edward Mallory had purchased to expand his cotton empire. The Mallory estate sprawled across nearly 2,000 acres of prime Mississippi Delta land, its grand columned mansion sitting like a white crown atop a gentle hill overlooking the river. 300 enslaved souls worked those fields from sunrise to sunset, their lives measured not in years, but in pounds of cotton picked, acres cleared, and the whims of their owner. Edward Mallory ruled his domain with the casual cruelty of a man who had never questioned his right to own other human beings, his word carrying the weight of life and death for those who toiled beneath the scorching southern sun. Hester's initial years on the plantation had been spent in the fields, her hands bleeding as she learned to pick cotton fast enough to meet the daily quotas that meant the difference between a meager supper and a night spent hungry in her cabin. But her quick mind and natural ability with cooking caught the attention of Martha Mallory, Edward's wife, who needed help in the big house kitchen after their previous cook had died of fever. The transition from field hand to house servant might have seemed like a blessing to outsiders, but Hester quickly learned that proximity to the master's family brought its own unique horrors. Working in the big house meant witnessing firsthand the casual violence that Edward Mallory inflicted on anyone who displeased him. She watched him beat field hands unconscious for the crime of working too slowly, saw him sell children away from their mothers as punishment for minor infractions, and endured his wandering hands whenever his wife wasn't, quote, present. The kitchen became Hester's domain by necessity, the one place where she could maintain some semblance of control over her circumstances. Preparing meals that kept the Mallory family satisfied, while finding small ways to assert her humanity in a world determined to deny it. For 8 years, Hester endured this existence, finding moments of joy in secret relationships with fellow enslaved people, particularly a field hand named Moses, who had been born on the plantation and knew its cry. Rhythms better than anyone. Their love affair had to be conducted in shadows and stolen moments, their hopes for a future together existing only in whispered conversations after the master's family had retired for the evening. When Hester became pregnant with Moses's child in 1845, both understood that their baby would belong to Edward Mallory from the moment of birth, property to be bought, sold, or disposed of according to his wishes. Little Sarah came into the world during a brutal August heat wave, her first cries mixing with the sound of cotton songs drifting in from the fields where her father worked. Hester clutched her daughter close during those precious first months, knowing that every day together was borrowed time. Martha Mallory had made it clear that the baby would be raised in the quarters with the other slave children, that Hester's duties in the kitchen took precedence over motherhood, but somehow Hester managed to keep Sarah close, smuggling the infant into the kitchen during quiet hours and nursing her while preparing the family's meals. The fragile bubble of happiness burst on a cold February morning in 1846 when Edward Mallory announced that he had sold Sarah to a trader heading to New Orleans. The baby was barely 6 months old, still dependent on her mother's milk, but Mallory needed quick cash to cover gambling debts and saw no reason to keep what he considered an unnecessary expense. Hester's screams as the trader carried Sarah away echoed through the big house, a sound of pure anguish that made even Martha Mallory turn away in shame, but Edward simply ordered Hester back to work, threatening her with a whipping if she didn't compose herself immediately. The loss of her daughter broke something fundamental in Hester's spirit, transforming her from a woman who endured her circumstances to one who began planning active resistance. She continued her duties in the kitchen, but now every meal became an opportunity to study her oppressors, to learn their habits and weaknesses. She noticed how Edward Mallory's drinking had increased over the years, how he often stumbled to his study after dinner to consume whiskey until he passed out in his chair. She observed Martha's growing dependence on laudanum to cope with her own misery, how the white woman spent her days in a haze of medication and denial about the horrors happening under her roof. Moses tried to comfort Hester during those dark months following Sarah's sale, but even his love couldn't heal the wound that had been carved into her heart. She began spending more time alone, walking the plantation grounds after her work was finished, studying the layout of buildings and fences with new eyes. The hog pen behind the main barn drew her attention particularly, the way the animals devoured everything placed before them with savage efficiency. She had seen them consume the carcasses of dead livestock, watched them strip bones clean in a matter of hours, and slowly an idea began forming in her mind. The inspiration for her eventual revenge came from an unlikely source: the plantation's previous cook who had died before Hester's arrival, but whose recipe book remained in the kitchen pantry. Among the carefully written instructions for cornbread and roasts, Hester discovered notes about local plants and their properties, including several warnings about oleander bushes that grew wild around the plantation. The beautiful flowering shrubs were common throughout Mississippi, their pink and white blossoms adorning many grand homes. But the previous cook had noted in careful script that every part of the plant was deadly poisonous, particularly the leaves when dried and crushed to powder. For months, Hester collected oleander leaves during her walks, drying them in hidden spots around her cabin, and grinding them into fine powder using a mortar and pestle she had taken from the kitchen. She tested small amounts on rats that plagued the slave quarters, watching how quickly the poison took effect, and calculating the dosage that would be needed for a man of Edward Mallory's size. The work was dangerous. Any discovery would mean certain death. But Hester felt no fear, only a cold determination to make her master pay for the countless lives he had destroyed. The opportunity finally came on a humid October evening in 1854. Edward Mallory had spent the day in Vicksburg conducting business, returning to the plantation in a foul mood after losing heavily at cards. He screamed at the house slaves for imagined infractions, struck Moses across the face for being too slow in caring for his horse, and demanded that dinner be served immediately despite arriving 2 hours late. Martha had already retired with her laudanum, leaving her husband to dine alone in the grand dining room while Hester served his meal with steady hands and a calm expression that concealed the storm raging in her heart. As was his custom, Mallory retreated to his study after dinner with a bottle of his finest Kentucky whiskey, the same room where he conducted the business of buying and selling human beings like cattle. Hester knew his routine by heart, how he would drink steadily for hours while reviewing plantation records and correspondence, often passing out at his desk, only to wake before dawn and stumble to his bedroom. Tonight would be different. Tonight, justice would finally come to the Mallory plantation. Hester waited until she heard the familiar sound of Mallory's drunken cursing echoing from the study before making her move. She prepared a silver tray with a fresh glass and a small plate of the honey cakes he favored, sprinkling the oleander powder liberally over the sweets before dusting them with powdered sugar to disguise any bitter taste. The poison was tasteless and odorless when properly prepared, qualities that had made it a favorite of assassins throughout history, though Hester knew nothing of such historical precedents. She only knew that tonight, Edward Mallory would pay for every life he had destroyed, every family he had torn apart, every moment of suffering he had inflicted on those under his power. The study door was slightly ajar when Hester knocked softly, balancing the tray in her hands while her heart hammered against her ribs. Mallory's voice was already slurred with drink as he told her to enter, barely glancing up from his ledgers as she placed the tray on the small table beside his chair. The room reeked of whiskey and cigar smoke, its walls lined with books that Mallory had never read, and portraits of ancestors who had built their fortune on the backs of enslaved people. A fire crackled in the marble fireplace, casting dancing shadows across the Persian rug that was worth more than most people earned in a lifetime. "About time you brought something decent to eat," Mallory mumbled, reaching for one of the honey cakes without looking at Hester. "Martha's been useless all day with her headaches and medicine. Sometimes I wonder why I keep any of you people around." He bit into the cake hungrily, washing it down with a generous gulp of whiskey. "These are actually good for once. Maybe you're finally learning to cook properly." Hester watched him consume 3 of the poisoned cakes in quick succession, her face a mask of subservient attention, while inside she counted the minutes until the oleander would take effect. The previous cook's notes had suggested that symptoms would begin within an hour, starting with nausea and dizziness before progressing to more serious complications. Mallory seemed to have a particularly strong constitution built up from years of heavy drinking, but even he couldn't withstand the amount of poison she had carefully calculated for his body weight and tolerance. "Pour me another drink and get out," Mallory ordered, waving dismissively at the empty whiskey glass. "I have work to do and I don't need you hovering around like a vulture." Hester obeyed silently, filling his glass with the amber liquid that would be his last drink, then retreating to the kitchen to wait. The big house settled into its usual evening quiet, the only sounds coming from the study where Edward Mallory continued his drinking, unaware that death was slowly coursing through his veins. The first sign that the poison was taking effect came nearly an hour later, the sound of Mallory's chair scraping against the wooden floor as he tried to stand. Hester crept closer to the study, listening to his increasingly labored breathing and confused muttering. Through the crack in the door, she could see him stumbling around the room, one hand pressed against the wall for support while the other clutched his stomach. The oleander was working exactly as the old cook's notes had predicted, shutting down his nervous system one function at a time. "What's happening to me?" Mallory gasped, his voice barely above a whisper. He tried to call for help, but the words came out as incoherent mumbles. His legs gave out completely, sending him crashing to the floor beside his desk, papers scattering as his body convulsed in the final throes of poisoning. Hester watched through the doorway as the man who had owned her life for 8 years died slowly and painfully, his face turning blue as his lungs forgot how to draw breath. When the convulsions finally stopped and Edward Mallory lay still on his expensive Persian rug, Hester felt no satisfaction, only a cold emptiness where her heart used to be. The hardest part of her plan still lay ahead. Moving quickly but carefully, Hester entered the study and began the grisly work of disposing of the evidence. Mallory's body was heavier than expected, dead weight that took all her strength to drag across the floor and out through the study's French doors that opened onto the plantation's gardens. The night was moonless and cloudy, providing perfect cover as she hauled the corpse across the grounds toward the hog pen behind the main barn. The hogs sensed fresh meat long before Hester reached their enclosure, their excited squealing cutting through the night air as they pressed against the wooden fence. She had prepared for this moment by bringing scraps from the kitchen earlier that evening, training the animals to associate her presence with feeding time. Now, she opened the gate and rolled Mallory's body into the muddy pen, watching as the hungry animals immediately began their work. The sounds that followed were horrible but necessary, the wet tearing of flesh and cracking of bones that would eliminate every trace of Edward Mallory's existence. Hester stood guard by the pen for hours, ensuring that the hogs consumed everything completely. By the time the first pale light of dawn began creeping across the Mississippi Delta, only scattered fragments of clothing and a few small bones remained in the mud, evidence that could belong to any of the dead livestock that had been fed to the animals over the years. She gathered the fabric scraps and buried them in different locations around the plantation, places where they would never be found, even if someone thought to look for them. The discovery that Edward Mallory was missing created chaos at the big house when Martha finally emerged from her laudanum haze the following afternoon. The master's horse was gone from the stable, his riding clothes missing from his wardrobe, and several bottles of whiskey had disappeared from the study. To all appearances, Edward Mallory had simply ridden away drunk sometime during the night, perhaps to continue gambling in Vicksburg or to visit one of the brothels he was known to frequent. Martha sent riders to search the roads and questioned every slave on the plantation, but no one had seen or heard anything suspicious. Hester maintained her role as the concerned house servant, expressing appropriate worry about the master's disappearance, while privately marveling at how easily the deception had succeeded. The other enslaved people sensed that something had changed, though none dared voice their suspicions openly. Moses caught her eye across the plantation yard, and she saw recognition there, an understanding that justice had finally visited the Mallory estate. The whispered conversations in the slave quarters took on a different tone, hope mixing with fear, as people began to imagine a world without Edward Mallory's cruelty hanging over their daily lives. Days passed without any sign of the missing master, and gradually the search efforts began to diminish. Martha Mallory retreated deeper into her addiction, leaving the plantation's management to the white overseer who cared more about his own comfort than maintaining the strict discipline that had characterized Edward's rule. The rhythm of life at the estate began to shift subtly, slaves finding small freedoms in the absence of their master's watchful eye, though everyone understood that the situation was temporary at best. The truth about Edward Mallory's fate remained locked in Hester's heart, a secret she shared with no one despite the growing bonds of trust among the enslaved community. She continued her duties in the kitchen, preparing meals for Martha and the overseer while planning for an uncertain future. The sale of the plantation seemed inevitable, given Martha's condition and lack of business acumen, which meant that all 300 enslaved people would eventually be sold to new masters. Their fates once again determined by the whims of white owners, who saw them as nothing more than valuable property. Winter arrived early that year, bringing with it a cold snap that froze the Mississippi River and made travel difficult throughout the region. The isolation suited Hester perfectly, providing time to process what she had done, while observing the gradual changes taking place around the plantation. Without Edward's iron fist maintaining order, the enslaved community began to organize itself differently, creating systems of mutual support and protection that had been impossible under his regime. Moses emerged as a natural leader, his knowledge of the plantation and calm demeanor making him a trusted voice in the quarters. The hogs that had consumed Edward Mallory thrived through the winter months, growing fat and healthy on their regular diet of kitchen scraps and corn. Hester felt a grim satisfaction watching them, knowing that her master's body had nourished the same animals he had threatened to feed disobedient slaves to during his lifetime. The irony was lost on everyone except her, another secret to carry alongside the knowledge of how she had achieved the impossible, killing her owner without leaving a trace of evidence behind. Spring brought disturbing news from the outside world, as tensions between North and South continued to escalate over the question of slavery's expansion into new territories. Martha Mallory's brother arrived from New Orleans to help manage the estate, a thin, nervous man named Charles Brennan, who had always disapproved of Edward's harsh treatment of the enslaved population. His more moderate approach created confusion among both the white staff and the enslaved community, as people struggled to understand what this change might mean for their future. Brennan's investigation into his brother-in-law's disappearance was more thorough than anyone had expected, focusing on financial records and business dealings that might provide clues about Edward's fate. Hester watched nervously as he interviewed plantation staff and examined the study where the murder had taken place. But months of weather and normal use had erased any physical evidence of what had happened that October night. The poison had long since left Edward's system, consumed along with the rest of him by creatures that could never testify to what they had witnessed. The closest Brennan came to the truth was when he questioned the hog pen's unusual productivity during the winter months, noting that the animals seemed remarkably well fed despite the plantation's reduced resources. The overseer explained this away by claiming credit for improved feeding schedules, eager to demonstrate his competence in managing the estate's resources. Brennan accepted this explanation without further inquiry, more interested in financial matters than agricultural details that seemed unrelated to his missing relative. As 1855 progressed, it became clear that Edward Mallory would never return to claim his plantation. Martha's mental state continued to deteriorate, her addiction to laudanum making her increasingly incapable of handling even basic decisions about household management. Brennan eventually convinced her to sell the estate and move to New Orleans where he could better care for her, a decision that sealed the fate of everyone who lived and worked on the property. The slave auction that followed was everything Hester had feared and more. Families tore apart as buyers selected individuals based on age, skill, and physical condition rather than human relationships. She watched Moses sold to a cotton planter from Alabama, their final goodbye limited to a brief touch of hands, as he was loaded onto a wagon with 19 other men bound for backbreaking labor in fields even more brutal than those they were leaving behind. Her own fate remained uncertain until the final day of the sale, when a middle-aged widow from Natchez purchased her to work as a cook in her modest household. Mrs. Elizabeth Crawford was a different kind of owner than Edward Mallory had been, a woman who had inherited slaves through marriage but seemed uncomfortable with the institution even as she participated in it. She treated Hester with a distant courtesy that was neither kind nor cruel, providing adequate food and housing while maintaining clear boundaries about their respective positions in society. The Crawford household consisted of only 6 enslaved people, a dramatic change from the massive community Hester had known at the Mallory plantation. Life in Natchez moved at a slower pace than the frantic activity of a large cotton plantation, giving Hester time to process the events of the previous year and plan for an uncertain future. The knowledge of what she had done to Edward Mallory remained her most closely guarded secret, though sometimes late at night she wondered if Moses had guessed the truth during their final moments together. The war that everyone seemed to anticipate was growing closer, bringing with it the possibility of freedom that seemed too wonderful to believe. Mrs. Crawford's health began failing during the winter of 1856, her persistent cough growing worse despite the medicines prescribed by local doctors. Hester found herself caring for a dying woman who owned her, a strange reversal of the natural order that forced both women to confront the artificial nature of their relationship. In her delirium, Crawford sometimes spoke to Hester as an equal, sharing memories of her childhood and fears about what would happen to her slaves after her death. The widow's death in March of 1857 created another period of uncertainty, as her estate was settled by relatives who had no interest in maintaining a household in Mississippi. Hester and the other enslaved people were sold once again, this time to a young planter named James Richardson, who had recently inherited land near Vicksburg and needed workers to establish his cotton operation. The cruel irony of returning to the same region where she had murdered Edward Mallory was not lost on Hester, though she knew that the chances of anyone connecting her to events from 3 years earlier were minimal. Richardson proved to be another Edward Mallory in training, a man who had grown up believing that harsh treatment was necessary to maintain control over enslaved workers. His plantation was smaller than the Mallory estate, but no less brutal in its daily operations, with punishments meted out for the smallest infractions and rewards limited to slightly larger food rations for exceptional productivity. Hester found herself working in the fields again rather than the kitchen, her hands once more bleeding from cotton picking as she struggled to meet quotas that seemed designed to be impossible. The similarities to her early years at the Mallory plantation were too strong to ignore, awakening memories and emotions that Hester had tried to bury along with her master's remains. She began studying Richardson's habits with the same cold calculation she had once applied to Edward Mallory, noting his drinking patterns and the layout of his smaller but still impressive house. The oleander bushes that grew throughout the South were present here as well, their poisonous beauty offering the same deadly opportunity she had seized years earlier. But circumstances were different now, the political situation growing more volatile as debates over slavery's future intensified throughout the nation. Richardson spoke constantly about the need to prepare for war against Northern aggression, training his male slaves in basic military drills, under the delusion that they would fight to preserve the system that enslaved them. The absurdity of expecting people to defend their own bondage was lost on Richardson, who seemed genuinely surprised when several field hands escaped during the summer of 1858, disappearing into the Mississippi wilderness despite the dogs and armed patrols sent to retrieve them. Hester considered escape herself, but realized that her knowledge of Edward Mallory's true fate made her too dangerous to risk capture. If she were caught and tortured, she might reveal secrets that would endanger other enslaved people who had covered for her during those crucial days following the murder. Instead, she focused on survival and information gathering, listening carefully to conversations between Richardson and his overseer about military preparations and political developments that might affect the Mallory plantation's future. The election of Abraham Lincoln in November of 1860 created panic among slaveholders throughout Mississippi, Richardson among them. He spoke openly about secession and the need to fight for Southern rights, rhetoric that became reality when Mississippi followed South Carolina out of the Union in January of 1861. The war that everyone had anticipated for years finally arrived, bringing with it changes that would reshape the entire social order of the South. Richardson enlisted as a captain in the Confederate Army shortly after Mississippi's secession, leaving the plantation under the management of his elderly father and the brutal overseer who had always been his most trusted lieutenant. The old man proved even more paranoid than his son, convinced that every enslaved person was plotting rebellion now that war had begun. The punishments grew more severe and arbitrary, creating an atmosphere of terror that reminded Hester of the worst days under Edward Mallory's rule. The war's impact on the Richardson plantation was immediate and devastating, with most of the young white men departing from military service and supplies becoming increasingly scarce as the Union blockade tightened Ashenburg. Around southern ports, food rations for enslaved workers were cut repeatedly, while the white family maintained their standard of living through hoarded supplies and connections with other planter families. Hester watched people she had grown to care about slowly starving, while Richardson's father complained about the inconvenience of wartime rationing. News of Union victories began filtering through the plantation's isolation during 1862, carried by enslaved people who worked on neighboring estates, and occasionally by Confederate deserters seeking food and shelter. The possibility of freedom, which had once seemed like an impossible dream, began to feel achievable as Northern armies advanced deeper into Southern territory. Hester allowed herself to hope for the first time in years, imagining a future where she might search for her daughter Sarah and live as something other than another person's property. The Union capture of New Orleans in April of 1862 sent shockwaves through Mississippi's planter class, proving that even the South's greatest cities were not immune to Northern military power. Richardson's father became increasingly erratic, his paranoia about slave rebellion leading to preemptive punishments for imagined infractions. 3 field hands were whipped to death during the summer for the crime of being found together after dark, their bodies left hanging as warnings to anyone else who might consider disobedience. Hester realized that survival might once again require direct action rather than passive endurance. The old man's evening routine was remarkably similar to Edward Mallory's, involving heavy drinking alone in his study while reviewing plantation records and correspondence with his son's military unit. The same oleander bushes grew around the Richardson house, their deadly beauty unchanged by the passage of years and the chaos of war. The same hungry hogs occupied pens behind the main barn, ready to consume whatever was fed to them without question or memory. But Hester hesitated to repeat the actions that had freed her from Edward Mallory's tyranny, partly because of changed circumstances and partly because of changes within herself. The years since her first murder had taught her that killing one evil man did nothing to change the system that enabled his cruelty, that other oppressors would always rise to take his place. The war offered the possibility of systemic change rather than personal revenge, making individual acts of violence seem less necessary even as they remained tempting. The decision was taken from her hands by Richardson's father himself, whose increasing paranoia led him to announce plans for selling most of the plantation's enslaved people before Union forces could liberate them. The sales would break up families and send people to plantations deeper in Confederate territory, areas where freedom might never arrive, even if the Union won the war. Faced with this threat to the community she had come to love, Hester made the same choice she had made years earlier when her daughter was sold away from her. The method was identical to what had worked with Edward Mallory: oleander powder mixed into honey cakes and served with the old man's evening whiskey. Richardson's father was even more susceptible to the poison than Mallory had been, his advanced age and poor health making him an easier target despite his smaller body weight. The symptoms appeared more quickly and progressed faster, leaving Hester less time to worry about discovery, but also less time to savor her revenge against another man who had treated human beings like livestock. The disposal of the body followed the same pattern as before, though the hogs were hungrier this time due to wartime food shortages that affected animals as well as people. By dawn, no trace remained of Richardson's father except for clothing scraps that could be explained away as belonging to any of the dead livestock that had been fed to the animals over the months. The old man's horse was missing from the stable along with his favorite rifle, suggesting that he had ridden away to join his son's military unit or perhaps to visit relatives in safer areas of the Confederacy. The overseer who took control of the plantation in the absence of both Richardsons proved more interested in self-preservation than maintaining discipline among the enslaved population. With Union forces advancing up the Mississippi River and Confederate authority collapsing throughout the region, he focused on gathering portable valuables and planning his own escape rather than preventing the gradual dissolution of the plantation system. Field hands began disappearing in small groups, following rumored paths to Union lines and freedom that grew more accessible with each passing week. Hester remained on the plantation longer than most, partly because of practical concerns about survival in a war zone, and partly because of her knowledge about two unsolved murders that made her cautious about attracting attention from any authorities. But as 1863 progressed, and Union control extended throughout Mississippi, the risks of staying began to outweigh the risks of leaving. The plantation was essentially abandoned by its white owners, leaving the remaining enslaved people free to make their own decisions about their futures. The journey to Union lines was harder than Hester had anticipated, involving weeks of travel through territory controlled by neither army and populated by desperate people willing to capture runaway slaves for whatever reward Confederate authorities might still offer. She traveled with a small group of other former slaves from the Richardson plantation, sharing food and protection while maintaining careful silence about her role in recent events. The group's destination was Vicksburg, where Union forces had established camps for freed slaves seeking protection and assistance. The Vicksburg that Hester returned to in late 1863 was vastly different from the prosperous river city she remembered from her years at the Mallory plantation. The famous siege had left buildings damaged and the population scattered, with Union military authorities struggling to maintain order while dealing with thousands of freed slaves seeking food, shelter, and protection. The contraband camps established for former slaves were overcrowded and undersupplied, but they represented freedom in ways that transcended physical comfort. Hester's arrival at the camp coincided with efforts by Union officials to document the experiences of freed slaves and gather intelligence about Confederate activities in rural areas. Her intimate knowledge of plantation operations and the local geography made her a valuable source of information, though she carefully avoided mentioning the specific fates of Edward Mallory and Richardson's father. Instead, she focused on troop movements, supply routes, and the locations of other plantations where enslaved people might be rescued by advancing Union forces. The work with Union officials brought Hester into contact with other freed slaves who had lived on plantations throughout the region, and gradually she began to piece together information about the broader network of the states where people she had once known might have been sold. The search for her daughter Sarah became a systematic effort involving correspondence with officials in New Orleans, Mobile, and other cities where slave markets had operated during the years since their separation. The hope of reunion sustained Hester through the difficult months of adjustment to freedom and the challenges of building a new life in a world transformed by war. News of the Confederate surrender in April of 1865 reached Vicksburg through a combination of official announcements and rumors carried by travelers from other parts of the collapsing Confederacy. The celebration among freed slaves was tempered by uncertainty about what peace would mean for their future, whether the freedom granted by military necessity would survive the end of hostilities. Hester joined the festivities, while privately wondering whether her own secrets would be safer in a world where Confederate authorities no longer existed to investigate unsolved crimes from the war years. The post-war period brought both opportunities and dangers for former slaves throughout Mississippi, as federal Reconstruction policies conflicted with local resistance to racial equality. Hester found work as a cook for a Union Army officer's family, her skills in the kitchen providing economic security while she continued searching for information about Sarah's whereabouts. The officer, Colonel William Hayes from Ohio, treated her with a respect that would have been impossible under the old system, though both understood that their relationship existed within the artificial structure of military beat. Occupation. Colonel Hayes's wife, Margaret, took a personal interest in Hester's search for her daughter, using her connections with other military families and northern charitable organizations to expand the investigation beyond what any individual could have accomplished alone. The network of correspondence that developed revealed the scope of the slave trade's impact on families, with children sold across vast distances and often given new names that made tracking nearly impossible. But gradually, patterns began to emerge from the chaos of scattered records and fading memories. A letter arrived from New Orleans in the summer of 1866, bearing news that changed everything Hester thought she knew about her daughter's fate. Sarah had indeed been sold to a sugar plantation south of the city, but she had died of yellow fever in 1851 at the age of 6. Buried in an unmarked grave, along with dozens of other enslaved children who had succumbed to disease during a particularly devastating epidemic. The confirmation of Sarah's death was devastating, but it also provided closure that allowed Hester to finally grieve properly for the daughter she had lost more than 20 years earlier. The end of her search for Sarah forced Hester to confront questions about her own future that she had been avoiding during the years of hoping for reunion. At 38 years old, she was no longer young, but still had decades of life ahead of her. Decades that could be spent in freedom if she was careful about protecting the secrets that had enabled her survival. The 2 murders she had committed would remain unsolved mysteries, their victims remembered as men who had disappeared during the chaos of war, rather than as casualties of a slave woman's desperate quest for justice. Colonel Hayes's family was transferred to a post in Kansas during the autumn of 1866, offering Hester the opportunity to accompany them to a state where racial attitudes were more liberal than those prevailing in Breed, Mississippi. The decision to leave the South was difficult, involving the abandonment of familiar places and people in exchange for unknown possibilities in a distant territory. But the alternative was remaining in a region where Reconstruction policies were already facing violent resistance from white supremacist groups determined to restore something resembling the old plantation system. The journey to Kansas took Hester through landscapes and communities she had never imagined during her years of bondage, revealing a vastly larger world than the narrow confines of plantation life had suggested. The small towns and farming communities of the Midwest operated according to different social rules than those that had governed her existence in Mississippi, though racial prejudice remained a constant factor in daily interactions. The Hayes family's protection provided some insulation from the worst manifestations of Northern racism, but Hester understood that her ultimate security depended on her own efforts to build an independent life. The town of Lawrence, Kansas, where Colonel Hayes was stationed, had been a center of anti-slavery activism before the war, and maintained a relatively welcoming atmosphere for freed slaves seeking new opportunities. Hester found work with several families, in addition to her duties with the Hayes household, gradually building a reputation as an exceptional cook whose skills commanded premium wages. The economic independence that followed was something she had never experienced during her decades of enslavement, providing both practical security and psychological validation of her worth as a human being. The establishment of her own small restaurant in 1868 represented the culmination of Hester's journey from slavery to freedom, a business built on the culinary skills that had once served to keep her alive under brutal masters. The restaurant occupied a modest building on Massachusetts Street, serving both the town's permanent residents and the soldiers stationed at the nearby fort. Her honey cakes became particularly popular, though Hester alone knew the irony of their association with the method she had once used to exact deadly revenge on her oppressors. The success of her business brought Hester into contact with other former slaves who had made similar journeys to Kansas, creating a community of mutual support that helped ease the psychological wounds left by all decades of bondage. The shared experiences of loss, survival, and hope created bonds that transcended the specific plantations and regions where they had been enslaved. But Hester's secrets remained her own, too dangerous to share even with people who had endured similar horrors under the slave system. Marriage came unexpectedly in 1870 when Hester met David Washington, a former slave from Virginia who had fought with Union forces during the war and settled in Kansas to work as a blacksmith. Their courtship was conducted with the careful respect of 2 people who had learned to value their freedom above all else, each understanding that their relationship represented a choice rather than an arrangement imposed by others. The wedding ceremony was held in the small church that served Lawrence's African American community, witnessed by friends who celebrated not just their union, but the very fact that former slaves could now make such, quote, decisions for themselves. David proved to be a gentle and understanding partner, someone who had witnessed enough violence during the war to appreciate Hester's occasional nightmares and periods of silence when memories of her enslaved years became too vivid to ignore. He never pressed her for details about her experiences on Mississippi plantations, accepting her reluctance to discuss certain aspects of her past as a natural response to trauma rather than evidence of hidden secrets. Their marriage provided Hester with emotional stability she had never believed possible, though she remained careful never to reveal the full extent of what she had done to achieve her freedom. The birth of their son James in 1872 brought Hester face to face with motherhood again, awakening memories of Sarah that she had tried to bury along with her grief. Holding her newborn son in her arms, she was overwhelmed by the realization that this child would grow up free, that no master could ever claim ownership of his body or sell him away from his family. The joy was almost too intense to bear, mixed as it was with sorrow for the daughter she had lost and determination that James would never experience the horrors that had shaped her own life. Raising a child in freedom required Hester to confront questions about what parts of her history to share and what secrets to carry to her grave. James grew up hearing stories about the plantation where his mother had been enslaved. But these carefully edited narratives focused on the strength and resilience of the enslaved community rather than the specific acts of violence that had punctuated his mother's journey to freedom. The murders of Edward Mallory and Richardson's father remained unspoken, protected by Hester's understanding that some truths were too dangerous to trust to anyone, even her beloved son. The restaurant continued to prosper throughout the 1870s, expanding into the building next door and employing several other former slaves who had made their way to Kansas in search of better opportunities. Hester took pride in providing jobs for people who had few other options, creating a small island of economic security within the broader challenges facing African Americans during the Reconstruction, era. The honey cakes that had once carried deadly poison now symbolized sweetness and success, their popularity helping to establish her reputation as one of Lawrence's finest cooks. Political developments in the South during this period reminded Hester of how precarious her freedom remained, even in Kansas. The end of Reconstruction in 1877 and the withdrawal of federal troops from former Confederate states created opportunities for white supremacists to restore systems of racial oppression through violence and intimidation. Reports from Mississippi spoke of former slaves being murdered or driven from their homes, of the freedoms promised by Union victory being systematically dismantled by groups like the Ku Klux Klan and other terrorist organizations. The knowledge that she had left 2 unsolved murders behind in Mississippi became both a source of anxiety and a form of protection as political conditions deteriorated throughout the South. If Confederate authorities had never solved the disappearances of Edward Mallory and Richardson's father during wartime, they were unlikely to reopen such investigations decades later, when more pressing concerns about maintaining white supremacy demanded their attention. The passage of time had transformed her crimes from dangerous secrets into historical curiosities, events from a vanished world that few people remembered or cared about. Hester's 50th birthday in 1878 was celebrated with a gathering at the restaurant that brought together the extended community of former slaves and their children who had built new lives in Kansas. The party was both a personal milestone and a collective acknowledgement of survival, a recognition that people who had been considered property 2 decades earlier were now business owners, skilled workers, and respected community members. David's toast to his wife praised her strength and determination without knowing the full extent of what those qualities had enabled her to accomplish. The arrival of a letter from Mississippi in 1879 created the greatest crisis Hester had faced since gaining her freedom, threatening to expose secrets she had believed were safely buried in the past. The correspondence came from a lawyer in Vicksburg who was settling the estate of Martha Mallory, Edward's widow, who had finally succumbed to her decades-long addiction to laudanum. The lawyer was attempting to locate former slaves from the Mallory plantation who might have information about Edward's disappearance, hoping to resolve legal questions about his presumed death that had complicated the distribution of family property. The letter had found Hester through the network of connections she had built while searching for information about her daughter, a paper trail that now threatened to lead investigators back to events from 25 years earlier. Her first instinct was to ignore the correspondence entirely, but she realized that failing to respond might draw more attention than providing carefully crafted answers to the lawyer's questions. The challenge was crafting responses that would satisfy legal curiosity without revealing any information that could reopen questions about Edward Mallory's true fate. Hester's reply to the Vicksburg lawyer was a masterpiece of strategic deception. Acknowledging that she had worked in the Mallory kitchen, but claiming to have no knowledge of her former master's disappearance beyond what everyone on the plantation had assumed at the time. She described Edward as a man prone to drinking and gambling, who often spoke of business trips to New Orleans and other cities, providing plausible explanations for why he might have left the plantation without press, informing anyone of his destination. The response was truthful enough to avoid outright lies, while omitting the crucial details that would have solved the mystery of Edward Mallory's fate. The lawyer's follow-up questions focused on other slaves who might have been present during the period of Edward's disappearance, particularly Moses and other field hands who had worked closely with the master's household. Hester provided what information she could about people's subsequent fates, though many had been sold away from the plantation years earlier, and their current whereabouts were unknown. The correspondence gradually diminished as the lawyer realized that the trail had grown too cold to follow, that too much time had passed, and too many witnesses had died or disappeared for any meaningful investigation to succeed. The resolution of the legal inquiry provided Hester with a sense of closure about her past crimes, confirmation that the passage of time had indeed buried Edward Mallory's true fate beyond the reach of earthly justice. But the experience also reminded her of how interconnected the world had become, how modern communications and transportation could threaten even carefully guarded secrets from decades past. The growing network of railroads, telegraph lines, and postal services that connected Kansas to the rest of the nation also connected her to the scenes of her former crimes in ways that would have been impossible during the antebellum period. The 1880s brought new challenges and opportunities as James grew into adolescence and began asking more pointed questions about his mother's experiences during slavery. Hester found herself walking an increasingly narrow line between honesty about the horrors of bondage and protection of the secrets that could still endanger her family's security. She shared stories about the strength of enslaved communities, the importance of resistance and mutual support, and the joy of achieving freedom. But she carefully avoided specifics that might lead her son to guess at the more violent aspects of her journey from bondage to liberty. The death of David Washington in 1884, the result of a heart attack suffered while working in his blacksmith shop, left Hester alone again for the first time since her arrival in Kansas. The grief was overwhelming, compounded by the realization that she had lost the only person who had known her as a free woman, rather than as someone defined by her experiences under slavery. James, now 12 years old, became her primary companion and the focus of all her hopes for the future, representing the possibility that her family line could escape entirely the legacy of bondage that had shaped her own life. The restaurant provided both economic security and social connection during the difficult years following David's death. Its success, a testament to skills that had once been exploited by masters, but now served her own interests and those of her community. The regular customers had become extended family, people who valued Hester not for her labor but for her cooking, her wisdom, and her role as one of Lawrence's most respected African-American citizens. The honey cakes continued to be the establishment's signature dish, though few customers knew the complex history that gave them such significance for their creator. James's graduation from high school in 1886 represented an achievement that would have been impossible during Hester's own youth, when education for enslaved people was forbidden by law and punishable by severe physical punishment. Watching her son walk across the stage to receive his diploma, she was struck by the transformation that had occurred within a single generation. The journey from illiteracy, enforced by bondage, to academic success, celebrated by an integrated community. The boy she had raised in freedom was preparing to enter a world of possibilities that she could barely have imagined during her own youth in Mississippi. The decision to tell James the truth about his mother's past came during his 19th year, when he announced his intention to travel south to research family history and visit the sites where his parents had been enslaved. Hester realized that her son's journey could lead him to ask questions that might uncover dangerous truths, that his innocent curiosity about family origins could inadvertently expose secrets that had remained hidden for more than 3 decades. The conversation that followed was the most difficult of her life, requiring her to reveal aspects of her character that she had hoped to keep buried forever. James listened in stunned silence as his mother described the murders of Edward Mallory and Richardson's father, the cold calculation that had gone into planning their deaths, and the methodical disposal of their bodies in hog pens that left no trace of evidence behind. The young man struggled to reconcile this revelation with his image of his mother as a gentle woman who fed hungry people and contributed to community charities. But gradually he began to understand the impossible choices that slavery had forced on people who had no other means of protecting themselves or their loved ones. The confession created a new bond between mother and son, based on complete honesty rather than the careful omissions that had characterized their relationship during his childhood. James's initial shock gave way to admiration for his mother's courage and resourcefulness, though both understood that the secrets she had shared could never be repeated to anyone else. The knowledge would die with them, protecting not only Hester's legacy, but also the safety of their descendants, who might still face consequences if her crimes were ever discovered and prosecuted. The 1890s brought signs that Hester's long life was entering its final phase, as arthritis and other ailments began to limit her mobility and force her to rely more heavily on employees to manage the restaurant's daily operations. James, now established as a successful businessman in his own right, took increasing responsibility for his mother's affairs, while respecting her desire to maintain independence as long as possible. The community that had supported her throughout her years in Kansas rallied around her during this period, recognizing her as a living link to the struggles and triumphs of the generation that had won freedom from slavery. The approach of the 20th century prompted reflection on the changes Hester had witnessed during her 7 decades of life. The transformation from a world where human bondage was legal and accepted to one where former slaves could own businesses, educate their children, and participate in democratic government. The progress was real, but incomplete, as evidenced by the rising tide of racial violence and legal discrimination that was sweeping across the South and beginning to influence politics in other regions as well. The freedoms won through war and constitutional amendment remained fragile, dependent on continued vigilance and struggle by people who understood their value. Hester's final years were spent in quiet contentment, surrounded by the community she had helped to build and sustained by the knowledge that her son would continue the family's journey toward full equality and integration into American society. The restaurant had become a landmark in Lawrence, its success proof that former slaves could thrive when given genuine opportunities to compete in a free market economy. The honey cakes that had once carried deadly poison now represented sweetness and hospitality, symbols of transformation that few customers could have understood or appreciated. The death of Hester Caldwell Washington in 1902, at the age of 74, marked the end of a life that had encompassed slavery, war, freedom, and success beyond anything she could have imagined during her youth in Bree, Mississippi. Her funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives she had touched through her cooking, her generosity, and her quiet strength in the face of challenges that would have broken many others. The eulogies praised her as a model of perseverance and achievement, though none of the speakers knew about the acts of deadly resistance that had enabled her escape from bondage. James Washington kept his mother's secrets until his own death in 1937, taking to his grave the knowledge of how Hester had murdered 2 of her masters and disposed of their bodies in ways that left no trace of evidence behind. The crimes remained unsolved mysteries in Mississippi records, listed among the many disappearances that had occurred during the chaotic years of war and Reconstruction. Edward Mallory and Richardson's father were remembered, if at all, as men who had vanished during a turbulent period in Southern history, their true fates known only to the woman who had killed them and the son who had chosen to protect her memory. The legacy of Hester's resistance lived on in ways that transcended her individual story, part of a broader pattern of enslaved people who had found ways to fight back against their oppressors, despite the enormous risks involved. Her success in achieving freedom and building a prosperous life in Kansas demonstrated that former slaves could thrive when given genuine opportunities. that the skills and intelligence suppressed by bondage could flourish under conditions of liberty and equality. The restaurant she had built became a symbol of African American entrepreneurship and community building, proof that people who had once been considered property could become valued contributors to American society. The truth about Edward Mallory's fate was never discovered by historical researchers who later studied the Mallory plantation and its role in Mississippi's antebellum economy. Scholarly accounts of the estate's operation mentioned the master's mysterious disappearance in 1854, but attributed it to the drinking and gambling problems that had troubled him during his final years. The possibility that an enslaved woman had poisoned him and fed his body to hogs never appeared in academic discussions of resistance to slavery, though such acts of violent rebellion were far more common than most historians acknowledged or documented. The hogs that had consumed Edward Mallory's remains lived out their natural lives on the plantation, eventually being slaughtered for meat that fed the same enslaved people who had whispered about their master's disappearance. The irony would have pleased Hester had she known about it. Another example of justice served through the cycles of nature that operated beyond human law and punishment. The bones and fragments that the animals had been unable to digest became part of the soil that nourished cotton plants, completing a transformation that connected her master's death to the crops that had been built on Bala. Enslaved labor. The Mallory plantation itself was eventually abandoned after Martha's death, its buildings falling into ruin as Mississippi's economy struggled to recover from the destruction of war and the end of slave labor. The grand mansion where Hester had served poisoned honey cakes to her master became home to owls and possums, its expensive furnishings rotting away, while vines claimed the columns that had once symbolized Southern wealth, power. The hog pen where Edward Mallory's body had been consumed disappeared beneath decades of accumulated debris, leaving no trace of its role in one woman's quest for justice and freedom. Modern visitors to the site where the Mallory plantation once stood would find only overgrown fields and crumbling foundations, with no historical markers to indicate the human dramas that had played out there during the antebellum period. The stories of the enslaved people who had lived and died there remain largely untold. Their experiences reduced to statistics and census records and inventory lists that recorded them as property, rather than as human beings with hopes, fears, and the capacity for both suffering and resistance. The descendants of other enslaved people from the Mallory plantation scattered across the country during the decades following emancipation, carrying with them fragments of stories that had been passed down through generations of whispered conversations and coded songs. Some settled in northern cities, where industrial jobs promised better opportunities than sharecropping in the post-Reconstruction South. Others moved west like Hester, seeking land and freedom in territories where the legacy of slavery weighed less heavily on daily interactions. A few remained in Mississippi, determined to claim their place in the communities where their ancestors had toiled in bondage. Among these scattered descendants, rumors persisted about what had really happened to Edward Mallory during that October night in 1854. The official story of his drunken departure from the plantation had never satisfied everyone who knew his character and habits, particularly other enslaved people who understood that masters rarely abandoned valuable property without compelling reasons. The whispered speculation that circulated through the quarters during the war years had evolved into family legends, stories that suggested justice had found Edward Mallory in ways that white authorities had never suspected or investigated. Moses Williams, the field hand who had loved Hester and fathered her lost daughter Sarah, survived the brutal conditions on the Alabama cotton plantation where he had been sold after Edward's disappearance. His own journey to freedom came through escape during the final months of the Civil War, when Confederate authority collapsed throughout the Deep South and enslaved people could flee without fear of organized pursuit. He made his way to Mobile and eventually to Detroit, where he found work in the emerging automobile industry and raised a family that knew only fragments of his experiences under slavery. In 1923, more than 60 years after his separation from Hester, Moses received a letter that would forever change his understanding of the woman he had loved and lost. The correspondence came from James Washington, Hester's son, who had spent years tracking down survivors from the Mallory plantation as part of his effort to preserve the history of his mother's community. James had located Moses through church records and mutual acquaintances, hoping to gather stories that would honor the memory of people who had endured and overcome the horrors of bondage. The meeting between James and Moses took place in a Detroit boarding house during the summer of 1923. Two elderly men representing different generations of the African American experience in, quote, freedom. Moses, now in his 80s, had lived long enough to see the Great Migration transform northern cities and witness the emergence of a vibrant black culture that celebrated rather than hid its southern roots. James, 20 years younger but already showing signs of the heart condition that would eventually claim his life, had dedicated his later years to documenting his mother's story and the experiences of other formerly enslaved people. Their conversation began with shared memories of the Mallory plantation, the brutal conditions that had shaped their early lives, and the community of resistance that had sustained them through the darkest periods of bondage. Moses spoke of his love for Hester and the pain of losing both her and their daughter to the arbitrary cruelties of the slave system. He described his own escape and the decades of wondering what had become of the woman who had been the center of his world during those desperate years in Mississippi. James listened carefully to Moses's recollections, comparing them to the stories his mother had told him about life before Edward Mallory's disappearance. The old man's memories painted a vivid picture of Hester as a young woman, someone whose strength and intelligence had been evident even under the crushing weight of enslavement. Moses spoke of her fierce love for their daughter, her determination to protect the enslaved community from their master's worst impulses, and the quiet rage that had burned within her as she witnessed daily injustices that went unpunished by any earthly authority. The moment of revelation came when Moses mentioned his long-held suspicions about Edward Mallory's true fate, theories he had developed during his final months on the plantation before being sold to Alabama. He had noticed Hester's strange behavior during the days following the master's disappearance, the way she had seemed both relieved and terrified, as if she knew something that others could only guess about. The timing of Mallory's vanishing, so soon after Sarah's sale, and during a period when Hester had been particularly withdrawn and angry, had suggested connections that Moses had never dared to voice openly. James faced a decision that would define the remainder of his life and determine how his mother's story would be remembered by future generations. The promise he had made to keep her secrets was weighing against his desire to share the full truth of her courage and resistance with someone who had loved her and deserved to understand what she had accomplished. The conversation stretched into the evening as James wrestled with competing loyalties, ultimately deciding that Moses's love for Hester and his own advanced age made him a safe repository for secrets that were already decades old. The revelation that Hester had murdered Edward Mallory struck Moses with the force of divine revelation, suddenly illuminating mysteries that had puzzled him for nearly 70 years. The careful planning, the use of oleander poison, and the disposal of the body in the hog pen represented a level of strategic thinking and cold determination that both amazed and frightened him. The woman he had loved was revealed as someone far more complex and dangerous than he had ever imagined, a person capable of calculated murder in service of justice that the legal system would never provide. Moses's reaction surprised James with its mixture of pride and sorrow rather than shock or condemnation. The old man had lived long enough to understand that enslaved people had faced impossible choices that required impossible actions, that survival sometimes demanded violence against those who held the power of life and death over entire communities. Hester's murders were not crimes in any meaningful sense, but acts of war against a system that treated human beings as property and offered no legal recourse for even the most heinous abuses. The two men spent the remaining days of James's visit in Detroit constructing a more complete picture of Hester's life and legacy, combining Moses's memories of her youth with James's knowledge of her later years in Colt, Kansas. The woman who emerged from their conversations was neither saint nor sinner, but something more complex and human, a person who had responded to extraordinary circumstances with extraordinary measures. Her success in building a prosperous life in freedom seemed even more remarkable when viewed against the backdrop of the violence that had enabled her escape from bondage. Moses died in 1926, taking with him the last living memories of Hester as a young enslaved woman and the community that had shaped her character during those formative years. His death marked the end of a direct link to the antebellum period and the beginning of a new phase in how Hester's story would be preserved and transmitted to future generations. James became the sole keeper of the complete truth about his mother's crimes, a responsibility that weighed heavily on him during his final years. The economic collapse of 1929 and the subsequent Great Depression created new challenges for African Americans throughout the country, including the descendants of enslaved people who had built modest prosperity during the more favorable conditions of the early 20th century. James Washington's business interests suffered along with those of most other entrepreneurs, forcing him to confront the possibility that the economic security his mother had worked so hard to achieve might not survive to benefit his own children. The restaurant that had been Hester's pride and legacy was sold during the worst years of the Depression, its recipes and reputation passing to new owners who had no knowledge of its founder's remarkable journey from slavery to success. The building that had housed her establishment was eventually demolished to make room for modern development, erasing one of the last physical connections to her presence in Lawrence. The honey cakes that had symbolized both poison and sweetness disappeared from local menus, their significance lost along with the stories that had given them meaning. James's own death in 1937 occurred during a period when interest in slavery and its aftermath was at a low ebb in American historical consciousness. Decades before the civil rights movement would renew scholarly and popular attention to the experiences of enslaved people and their descendants. His passing marked the end of any living connection to Hester's secrets, ensuring that her crimes would remain forever buried in the past. The knowledge of how she had murdered Edward Mallory and Richardson's father died with him, leaving only the official records of 2 unsolved disappearances from the chaotic years of the mid-19th century. The onset of World War II and its aftermath brought new attention to questions of racial justice and historical memory, as Americans confronted the contradictions between their stated values and their treatment of minority populations. The experiences of enslaved people and their descendants began receiving more serious scholarly attention, though most research focused on documented forms of resistance rather than the violent acts of individual revenge that had characterized Hester's approach to liberation. Academic interest in the Mallory plantation emerged during the 1960s as part of broader efforts to document the history of slavery in Mississippi and its impact on subsequent economic and social development. Researchers examined surviving records from the estate, interviewed descendants of both enslaved and white families associated with the plantation, and attempted to reconstruct the daily lives of the hundreds of people who had lived and worked there during the antebellum period. Edward Mallory's mysterious disappearance was noted in these studies, but never satisfactorily explained. Listed among the many disruptions that had affected plantation operations during the turbulent 1850s, the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s created a new context for understanding and appreciating the resistance efforts of enslaved people, including acts of violence that previous generations of historians had ignored or condemned. The growing recognition that enslaved people had been active agents in their own liberation rather than passive victims of white oppression opened space for more nuanced discussions of how individuals had fought back against their oppressors, using whatever means were available to them. Modern DNA testing and forensic archaeology techniques that emerged during the late 20th century offered new possibilities for investigating historical mysteries like Edward Mallory's disappearance. Though the passage of more than a century had eliminated most physical evidence that might have survived from his murder and disposal, the site of his death had been transformed multiple times by subsequent development, making any meaningful archaeological investigation impossible, even if researchers had known where to look for remains. The growth of genealogical research and family history projects during the early 21st century brought renewed attention to the experiences of enslaved families and the ways that slavery had shaped subsequent generations of African American communities. Descendants of people who had been enslaved on the Mallory plantation began connecting with each other through online databases and historical societies, sharing stories and documents that had been preserved in family collections for more than a century. Among these descendants, rumors and legends about Edward Mallory's fate persisted as family lore passed down through generations of oral tradition. Some stories suggested that he had been killed by enslaved people seeking revenge for his cruelties, while others maintained that he had simply abandoned the plantation during a period of financial difficulty. The truth remained elusive, protected by the careful silence that Hester and her son had maintained about events that were too dangerous to record in letters or diaries that might survive for historians to discover. The establishment of museums and historical sites dedicated to preserving the memory of slavery and its aftermath created new opportunities for telling the stories of enslaved people and their descendants, including those who had resisted their oppression through both peaceful and violent means. These institutions faced complex challenges in presenting historically accurate accounts of resistance, while avoiding sensationalism that might overshadow the broader themes of survival, community building, and, quote, eventual triumph over oppression. The interpretation of individual acts of violence like Hester's murders required careful consideration of context and motivation, distinguishing between criminal behavior and justified responses to systematic brutality that offered no legal remedies or protection. Modern historians and museum professionals struggled with how to present such stories in ways that honored the courage and desperation of people who had faced impossible choices, while educating contemporary audiences about the realities of life under slavery. The legacy of Hester's resistance lived on in ways that transcended her individual story, part of a broader pattern of defiance that had helped to undermine the stability of the slave system and contribute to its eventual collapse. Her success in achieving freedom and building a prosperous life demonstrated that formerly enslaved people possessed the intelligence, skills, and determination needed to succeed when given genuine opportunities to compete on equal terms with white Americans. The honey cakes that had once carried deadly poison became symbols of transformation and redemption, representing the ability of people to overcome even the most desperate circumstances and create something beautiful from the materials of their oppression. The recipes that Hester had developed in her Kansas restaurant continued to influence local cuisine long after her death. Though few people who enjoyed these dishes knew about their connection to one woman's remarkable journey from bondage to freedom, the question of whether Hester's murders were justified remained complex and personal, dependent on individual understanding of the moral choices available to people who lived under systems of legal oppression that offered no protection from abuse or exploitation. Her actions represented one response to impossible circumstances, neither better nor worse than the choices made by other enslaved people who found different paths to resistance and eventual liberation. The complete truth of Hester's story would remain forever hidden, protected by the silence of those who had loved her enough to carry her secrets to their graves. But the broader themes of her life, courage in the face of oppression, determination to protect family and community, and the ultimate triumph of human dignity over systematic dehumanization, continued to inspire people who learned about her journey from slavery to freedom and success in the American Midwest.